On May 30th, 1431, at noon, in the Vieux-Marche Square in Rouen, France, a young girl was executed at the stake on charges of heresy. Her name was Joan of Arc, aged 19 years, and for months, known as the Maid of Orléans and the Miracle Girl, she had saved France. From England, why did Joan of Arc, the savior, have to be branded a heretic and executed? To understand this, we must look at her upbringing and the background of the 100 Years' War between England and France, focusing on Joan of Arc's short life. Let's go back about 420 years before Joan's birth to 987 AD, following the death of King Louis V. Hugh Capet, the Count of Paris, was crowned King of France, marking the beginning of the Kingdom of France. However, the Capetian dynasty had a weak power base. Successive kings struggled to strengthen royal authority. Fortunately, they were blessed with male heirs for generations, allowing the dynasty to last for over 300 years. However, in 1328, Charles IV, the last Capetian king, died suddenly, without leaving a male heir, ending the Capetian dynasty that had lasted 341 years. With the sudden death of Charles IV, the succession to the French throne was thrown into turmoil. A primary candidate that emerged was Edward III, the son of Charles IV's sister, Isabella, who had married into England. However, France rejected Edward and crowned Philip VI of Valois, a cousin of Charles IV, but the issue went beyond succession. The true objective was a territorial dispute. Edward also claimed the French throne, triggering the 100 Years' War. Then, in September 1339, Edward III invaded northern France, entering a full-scale 100 Years' War between France and England. Although the war began, the French Grand Fleet was destroyed by the invading English fleet. Securing control of the sea and enabling transport to the continent, England poured troops into France. In 1346, leading an army of 10,000. Edward landed in Normandy, quickly seizing La Hogue and Caen, continuing his advance to occupy Calais and closing in on Paris. As for the French army's repeated defeats, the cause can be pointed to their failure to adapt to new combat methods. Regarding weapons, the French army's crossbows had high killing power, but they were mechanical and heavy. Firing 2 arrows a minute was the limit. In contrast, England's new longbows were light, easy to handle, and allowed for rapid fire of 10 to 12 arrows per minute. Also, the French knights were supported by the spirit of medieval chivalry, hoping to gain honor in battle and receive the cheers of ladies. They placed more value on their pride as knights than on the victory or defeat of the army against England, which was considered the most organized unified state in Europe. They were destined to be defeated. Although called the 100 Years' War, the fighting did not continue uninterrupted for 100 years. There were interruptions with truces. In the French army, daily wages were paid according to rank during wartime. Wages were paid even to mercenaries, who were not noble troops, but when a truce occurred, wages were not paid. Becoming unpaid, the mercenaries turned into bands of brigands called grands comp, attacking villages and looting. Since the battlefields of the 100 Years' War were entirely within France, farmers were driven from their villages by war, and when the war paused, they were looted by brigands. Suffering from such misery, furthermore, in 1348, what shook Europe was the spread of the plague, known as the Black Death. Paris counted 100,000 deaths. Spreading from Western Europe to Russia, it is said that 1/4 to 1/5 of the population was lost, becoming a major factor in population decline due to the plague and internal troubles. In both France and England, the war was temporarily suspended. In 1355, the war resumed. Edward III's son, clad in black armor, Edward the Black Prince, landed in Bordeaux and began advancing into the Languedoc region held by England. In France, Philip VI died and John II ascended the throne. Then, in 1364, John II died at 45 and Charles V succeeded him. Charles V, known as the Wise, took charge of the government and embarked on reconstruction amidst the chaos of war. Militarily, he placed Bertrand du Guesclin as the High Constable and took action to recapture territory lost to England through Charles V's reforms. The country saw remarkable recovery. Then, in 1369, war began again. Edward III's son, the Duke of Lancaster, John of Gaunt, landed in Calais. Since his elder brother, the Black Prince, who had advanced earlier, had returned home due to illness in 1371, John of Gaunt became the spearhead of the invasion of France, but without remarkable progress. He returned in 1374. In 1380, the wise king who led France to recovery died at 45. Furthermore, the famous general Bertrand du Guesclin also died of illness. During the siege of Châteauneuf-du-Randon and Gévaudan, with the loss of the two men who carried the political and military burdens, France faced a major turning point, succeeding Charles V. Charles VI ascended the throne at age 12. Since he was a minor, his uncles became regents to assist him. In 1385, the 17-year-old Charles VI married the 14-year-old Isabeau of Bavaria, daughter of Duke Stephen III, reputed for her beauty. However, Isabeau would later drag France into further chaos. In 1388, attaining adulthood, Charles decided to end the regency of his uncles and declared he would rule personally. He reinstated the advisors from the era of his father, Charles V. To stabilize finance and currency, he curbed the power of his uncles, who had enriched themselves under the guise of guardianship, and appointed his brother, the Duke of Orléans, as an advisor. He worked on improving the administration, which had been chaotic, and focused on domestic stability. Then, in August 1392, while leading an army from Le Mans to Brittany, Charles VI was approached by a ragged, white-haired old man who warned him, "Do not ride further, there is a traitor." However, Charles continued to march in the scorching sun. Suddenly, Charles drew his sword, shouting loudly, and tried to attack the soldiers around him. They managed to subdue the rampaging Charles, tied him to a cart, and returned to Le Mans. Charles VI's madness is said to be due to repeated inbreeding. His parents, Charles V and Queen Jean, were in a consanguineous marriage, forbidden by the church. Queen Jean also died in 1377 after suffering from mental disorders, so it was said that the cause of Charles VI's madness was due to his lineage, though this is not entirely clear. In any case, Charles VI's madness became a factor of internal turmoil, since it was virtually impossible for him to govern, and there was no male heir between Charles and Isabeau at the time. His brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, claimed succession rights. On the other hand, His uncle, Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, who had long held animosity towards Louis, opposed a regency. He insisted that Queen Isabeau stand in for the king, while Philip himself would serve as regent. Eventually, the majority opinion leaned towards Philip, Duke of Burgundy, and Queen Isabeau rose to the position of supreme power. In 1404, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, who intended to control the state behind Queen Isabeau, died suddenly. Seeing this as an opportunity, Louis, Duke of Orléans, approached Isabeau, and an intimate relationship developed between them, going beyond political speculation. It could be called a lover's relationship. Louis became the shadow ruler as Isabeau's guardian. The one who found this situation bitter was John the Fearless, the son of Philip, Duke of Burgundy, who had died 3 years earlier. Relations between Jean and Louis became hostile. There were already scandalous rumors about Louis's flamboyant affairs, and amid this, rumors even suggested that Jean's wife, Margaret, was Louis's lover, with his anger reaching its peak. Jean executed a plan to assassinate Louis, enraged the Orleans faction, united around Bernard VII, Count of Armagnac, Louis's father-in-law. Bernard brought the Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VII, born to Queen Isabeau, in 1403, to his side, and began fighting the Burgundian faction. This created the structure of conflict between the Armagnacs and the However, friction arose between Count Bernard and Isabeau, and Queen Isabeau pleaded to the opposing Duke Jean of Burgundy for help. Effectively abandoned by his mother Isabeau, Charles VII would spend his days in misfortune until the arrival of Joan of Arc. Be that as it may, by 1410, the Armagnac sphere of influence had spread to the south and west of France, while the Burgundian-controlled areas were in the north and east. As these two major powers clashed, the central city of Paris and its surroundings were engulfed in the turmoil of war. Amidst this civil war, on January 6, 1412, in the small village of Domrémy in northeastern France, a girl was born to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy. It was Joan of Arc. Domrémy, where Joan of Arc was born, had the wine-producing region of Champagne to the north and Burgundy to the south. The Lorraine region bordering the village was also rich in nature and had long flourished. As a wine-producing area, wine was essential for religious ceremonies and deeply involved in people's lives. Joan grew up as a farmer's daughter with 5 siblings, her parents, 3 older brothers, and a younger sister, Catherine, who died young. Her mother's surname, Romy, it was not a family name, but a title meaning someone who had completed a pilgrimage to Rome. As the name suggests, she was a deeply religious woman, perhaps influenced by her mother. Joan, the eldest daughter, was also a girl who lived by her faith. However, the shadow of the 100 Years' War between France and England began to fall, even on the relatively peaceful village of Domrémy. Security deteriorated as unpaid mercenaries from suspended wars and surrounding armed groups raided and looted. Her father Jacques played an important role in the village, taking charge of guiding villagers to evacuate to prevent livestock from being stolen. It is said that Jacques owned 20 hectares of land, so Joan's family was not wealthy, but not poor either. Joan and the village children played around a beech tree on the outskirts of the village, which they called the fairy tree, drank water from a nearby spring, danced around the tree, and sang songs. They enjoyed a gentle life in rich nature, side by side with worsening security. However, the domestic situation deepened in chaos. In 1415, Henry V of England proposed a plan to invade France to the Parliament and landed on the French mainland. Starting the latter half of the 100 Years' War, viewing the situation seriously, the Burgundians and Armagnacs rapidly approached each other to conclude a peace treaty. However, subsequent confusion caused cracks between the two factions, plunging them back into conflict and a quagmire of civil war. In 1419, Isabeau, trying to end the civil war, conspired with Jean to settle the internal conflict through an alliance with England. The panicked Armagnacs brought the Burgundians to peace talks to explore the possibility of a truce. However, at that meeting, whether accidental or planned, is unknown, Jean was assassinated. The talks broke down. Due to this incident, the Burgundians formed an alliance with England. In 1420, by the Treaty of Troyes, negotiated by Pierre Cauchon, a member of the University of Paris, it was decided that King Henry V of England would marry Isabeau's daughter, Catherine, and that the child born between them would inherit the French throne. This created a new structure of the Burgundian-English alliance army versus the Armagnacs, leading to a complex situation where two kings existed within France. In 1421, Henry VI was born to Henry V and Catherine, becoming King of England and France. The following year, 1422, Henry V died. Shortly after, the mad King Charles VI, who had repeatedly cycled through madness and lucidity, also died. The era changed dizzyingly, leaving the powerless Charles VII as the Dauphin in August 1425. The 13-year-old girl from Domrémy, Joan of Arc, heard the voice of God for the first time in her garden. The voice said, "Behave correctly, attend church diligently, preserve your virginity until God permits." The voice appeared occasionally and changed to extraordinary commands like "Save France." Indeed, for Joan, a mere farmer's daughter from a small village, this was extraordinary. Surprised and afraid, Joan said, "I cannot ride a horse, nor have I ever held a sword. What can someone like me do?" The voice gradually became more specific. "Go to Vaucouleurs and meet the lord of the castle. Go to Chinon, take the Dauphin to Reims and have him crowned." Chinon was the town where the Dauphin Charles VII was staying, and Reims was the crucial place, where only those who had their coronation at the Notre Dame Cathedral were recognized as King of France. The voice appeared to Joan for 3 years, pressing her for a decision. In 1428, turning 16, Joan decided to obey the voice of God, together with her cousin's husband, Duran Lassues, a simple young man 15 years her senior. She left Domrémy for the town of about 17 kilometers north. Arriving at the castle, Joan met the garrison commander, Robert de Baudouin, and told him she had come by God's will. She conveyed God's word that Robert should lend her his power to go to Chinon. The commander, Robert, likely thought she was a delusional little girl. Naturally, he turned Joan away. Returning dejectedly to Domrémy with Duran Lassues, Joan resolved again to aim for the following year, in January 1429, what awaited Joan at the castle were the insults and ridicule of the guards. Driven away again, Joan stayed at the house of a wheelwright named Henry Leroyer in looking for a chance to meet Robert. Joan's presence in the town attracted people's attention. Rumors of the girl who attended Mass diligently and supposedly heard God's voice spread throughout the town. Intrigued by stories from his aides, the rumors reached Yolande of Aragon, Charles VII's mother, and an influential figure at Chinon for the struggling Armagnac faction, that is, the Dauphin's faction. Joan, who claimed to hear God's voice, might have seemed valuable. An order was sent from the Dauphin's faction to summon Joan of Arc to Chinon. Robert, who had begun to show interest in Joan, sent her off to Chinon with an escort of 6, including 2 heavy knights and the royal messenger Colet de Vie. Changed into men's military clothing prepared by Robert for safety on the road, Joan departed on February 22nd, seen off by Robert, staying at monasteries and presbyteries or camping out. They covered about 500 kilometers in 11 days. After this forced march, Joan and her party of 7 arrived in Chinon at noon on March 4th. On the evening of March 6th, Joan entered the castle of Chinon for an audience with Charles VII. Led by the master of ceremonies into the Great Hall, Joan was met by over 300 beautifully dressed lords, knights, and monks, illuminated brightly by dozens of torches. Amidst them, she found the 26th Dauphin Charles, whom she had never seen before. Joan announced her name and told him that she was sent by God to see him consecrated and crowned at Reims to become king. The lords and the Dauphin were surprised that a mere 17-year-old peasant girl spoke her opinion so eloquently. Before them, however, it is thought that the Dauphin side had made preparations for the audience in advance. Touched by Joan's overflowing enthusiasm and faith, the Dauphin Charles came to believe in and support her actions. However, an atmosphere of skepticism remained within the court regarding Joan. After the audience with Charles, it was decided that a legal inquiry would be held. A religious tribunal was set up in 70 kilometers south of Chinon, where Joan was interrogated. Finally, assuming that one who serves God must be pure, a test of Joan's virginity was conducted. This was because her claim of hearing God's voice raised suspicions of witchcraft, since witches were thought to copulate with the devil. Proving she was a virgin would clear her of that suspicion. The examination was conducted by 2 ladies, and confirmation was brought that Joan was a virgin. The inquiry, which took 3 weeks, worked in Joan's favor, concluding that there was no way to break the status quo other than through divine salvation. The Dauphin Charles decided to dispatch Joan to save Orleans, which was on the English side, since Henry VI at Windsor Castle, who became King of France by the Treaty of Troyes. It was not yet 1 year old. His uncle John, Duke of Bedford, took power as regent and commanded military operations against France. Orleans is located in the Loire Valley. In ancient times, it was a Gallic fortress conquered by Julius Caesar in 52 BC and rebuilt by the Roman Empire. During the Capetian dynasty, it was a center of the royal domain. In 1392, Charles VI gave it to his brother Louis, creating the House of Orleans, after Louis was assassinated by Jean of Burgundy in 1407. Louis's eldest son Charles succeeded him as Duke. However, that Charles was taken prisoner by England. At the Battle of Agincourt, managing Orleans was Charles's half-brother, King de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orleans, was born to Louis, Duke of Orleans, and his mistress Mariette d'Enghien. Therefore, Orleans was effectively without its lord, according to the chivalry of the time. Attacking a town without a lord was considered an act against the knightly spirit, but such rules were ignored. If Orleans, a strategically vital city protecting the capital Paris, were conquered, England could easily advance into southern France. For France, there was a grave possibility of facing an existential crisis. The Duke of Bedford summoned Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury, from England to participate in the campaign against Orleans. Earl Salisbury had participated in the 100 Years' War from early on, achieving numerous brilliant victories. At Agincourt, Caen, Harfleur, and Rouen in 1419, he became the commander of the Normandy region, and in 1424, he won distinct military honors at the Battle of Verneuil. He was a celebrated commander with a glorious combat history, who had returned to England. The fact that the Duke of Bedford called Salisbury from home for the conquest of Orleans shows how important it was. On October 12, 1428, Earl Salisbury commenced the siege of Orleans with famous English commanders William de la Pole and John Talbot, isolating the town and starving it. Charles felt that what France lacked in the siege of Orleans was not military power, but high morale. In fact, Philip, Duke of Burgundy, who was participating in the siege with England, had withdrawn all his troops due due to a conflict with the Duke of Bedford. Moreover, the great English commander Earl Salisbury was critically wounded by a cannonball fired from Orleans on October 24, 1428, and died 8 days later. It was judged that a total assault by the English army alone was impossible, and that Orleans could hold out if there were food supplies and a boost in morale. Joan of Arc was given the role of military commander for the relief of Orleans. With aides and staff officially appointed, she entered Blois on April 22nd. At this time, Charles VII's confidant, Georges de la Tremelle, summoned a young noble relative from Brittany. He was Guy de Race, related by blood to the famous High Constable Bertrand du Guesclin, who died in the siege of Gaveston. He was a unique and dazzling figure in the story of Joan of Arc, inheriting vast wealth and territory from his ancestors. Guy de Race, who had achieved enough to be considered a future high commander, would run through battlefields with Joan of Arc. Eventually, dominated by madness, he would cause numerous pathological incidents, but that is a story for another time. Returning to Joan of Arc at the supply base in Blois, she joined the waiting commanders and units like Gilles de Res. Together with a convoy loaded with food like livestock and vegetables, they departed Blois on April 27, 1429, aiming for Orleans during the 2-day journey to Orleans. Antipathy towards Joan spread among the veteran nobles and staff. I don't know if she heard God's voice or what, but we don't want to be commanded by a peasant girl with no combat experience. We will fight in our own way. Thus, a rift formed between Joan and the officers, keeping the emotional discord. Fitting for God's army, Joan stood at the head of the column, maintaining discipline, and hurried on the road to Orleans while singing hymns. Against Joan, who wanted to march west to Orleans and force a breakthrough through enemy lines, the staff ignored her and circled to the east, where enemy forces were thin. Succeeding in bringing in food and supplies, Joan was furious that her opinion was ignored. But after consulting with Jean, the acting lord who came out from Orleans to meet them, the royal army returned to Bulgaria. Only Joan, who was absolutely necessary to boost the morale of the Orleans army, entered Orleans with Jean. On April 29, 1429, Joan of Arc arrived in the midst of the siege of Orleans. Rumors of the Virgin Joan sent by God had already reached Orleans. Her entry brought joy to the citizens and served as a great beacon of hope for the soldiers, greatly boosting their morale, which had been exhausted by the long siege. Her symbolic presence gave the army belief and courage. Entering May, the royal army that had retreated to Blois also joined under Joan's command. The French army captured English fortresses, one after another. Joan herself, though wounded, encouraged the soldiers and stuck to her beliefs in the midst of battle. On May 8th, the English army was finally forced to withdraw from Orleans, ending the siege. This victory instantly raised Joan's fame and brought hope to all of France. Furthermore, in June, continuing her advance with commanders and soldiers who had become completely submissive to her. After the victory at Orleans, Joan won an overwhelming victory at the Battle of Patay. The morale of the French army rose even higher. After the liberation of Orleans, Joan proposed a coronation ceremony in Reims for Charles VII, the heir to the French throne. Reims was the traditional coronation site for French kings, and a coronation there was a vital ceremony. To prove Charles's legitimacy as king, thanks to Joan's command and French strategy, breaking through the resistance of the English army and Burgundians, on July 17, 1429, Charles VII was officially crowned King of France at Reims Cathedral. Joan also participated in this coronation. Her role became a symbol of French victory and unity. However, from around this time, a shadow began to creep over Joan. Joan's next goal was the recapture of the capital, Paris, held by the Duke of Bedford, but Charles VII, now King of France, moved towards peace with the behind the scenes to break their alliance with England. Therefore, Charles VII was reluctant about Joan, aiming for Paris. Impatient, Joan attacked Paris with willing nobles and warlords. After a long and fierce battle, Joan took an arrow to her body and was forced to retreat. The attack on Paris failed, but Joan's fame rose even further. However, limits to her existence began to appear, and factions within the French court that did not think well of her also existed. In 1430, Joan of Arc was participating in battles in northern France. At the time, France continued the war against England and its ally, the Burgundians, and Joan was active on the front lines. The fierce battleground of Compiègne was a key city located north of Paris and a strategically essential base for France. The city was besieged by the Burgundians, and Joan joined the fight to liberate it. As usual, Joan adopted aggressive tactics and prepared to attack the enemy camp. On May 23rd, leading a small unit, she sortied from Compiègne and charged the besieging Burgundian forces. This action was intended as a surprise attack, a bold tactic typical of Joan. However, the situation did not proceed as Joan expected. The Burgundian army reacted quickly and pushed the French army back. The French army was forced to retreat, and Joan also retreated towards the gates of Compiègne. It became a chaotic melee. As the French retreated into the city, the gates were closed, amidst the confusion, leaving Joan and part of her unit stranded outside, surrounded by the Burgundian army. She was unhorsed and captured. Joan's capture was a major victory for the enemy, and a significant event that shook the morale of the French army, which believed she was under divine protection. Later, she was handed over from the Burgundians to the English army. This capture is sometimes said to be the French court abandoning her, marking a major turning point in Joan's fate. The captured Joan was handed over to the Burgundian commander, Jean de Luxembourg. After that, she was detained in various castles for about 6 months. England felt Joan's existence was a great threat, and negotiated to have her handed over by paying a large sum to the Finally, in November 1430, Joan was handed over to England to be tried in Rouen. When Joan was captured, the French court took no concrete action to rescue her. It is pointed out that Joan's rapid rise to fame may have caused jealousy and conflict within the court. Also, seeing that nobles and soldiers who fought with her began to worship her, an atmosphere viewing Joan's very existence as dangerous may have emerged. It is also said that Charles VII and his aides abandoned her, thinking she had already fulfilled her role. Joan's capture was a major turning point in the war between the French and English armies, since her presence was crucial for boosting French morale. Her capture was also a psychological victory for the enemy. On the other hand, with her capture, her story entered a new phase, a trial for heresy and martyrdom. This would solidify her image as a legendary hero even further. The religious trial of Joan of Arc in Rouen. From January to May 1431 was the decisive event, leading her life to a tragic end. This trial was conducted through a complex process involving intertwined religious, political, and personal elements. For England and its ally, the Burgundians, the purpose of Joan of Arc's religious trial was to publicly condemn her as a heretic and break the morale of the French army. At the time, Joan was a symbolic figure who had led the French army to victory. claiming to have received divine revelation, and she was a major threat to the English army. To legally eliminate her, the religious trial was used as a political tool. The background intent was for England to publicly condemn her, to neutralize her politically. Furthermore, by condemning Joan as a witch, it would be possible to discredit the authority of the French King Charles VII, who had been crowned in Reims through the aid of a witch. Joan was detained in a castle in Rouen, and the trial by the clergy began. The trial was presided over by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, who was under English control. Originally, the Bishop of Reims Cauchon had been expelled by the Dauphin's army's entry into Reims. It is said he held a personal grudge against Joan of Arc for his repeated exiles. Many of the judges were those who pledged allegiance to England, and it was far from a fair trial. Also, Joan was not allowed a defense attorney and had to defend herself. The main points of the trial were Joan's claim of hearing God's voice and her wearing of male soldiers' clothing, which was deemed contrary to church law. Also, her refusal to obey church orders was considered an act of heresy or influence by witchcraft. Essentially, heresy refers to thoughts or actions that deviate from the officially established doctrines of a religion. The Catholic Church severely cracked down on heresy as something that disturbed the order of the faith community. In 1252, inquisitions became stricter and torture was permitted. Subsequently, fairly strict norms were established, and heretics came to be punished by burning at the stake. In Joan of Arc's case, the reason for being branded a heretic had a political background as well as a religious one. Specifically, Joan testified that she acted upon hearing voices from saints like Archangel Michael and Saint Catherine. This was treated as heresy, as a personal revelation contrary to church doctrine. Also, women wearing men's clothes was considered ethically contrary at the time and deemed a heretical act. Furthermore, her attitude of continuing to protect her own faith without obeying the church judges was viewed as disregarding the authority of the church. In Joan's case, these suspicions were pursued in the religious trial. But Joan repeatedly gave calm and witty answers to these questions, often perplexing the judges. For example, when asked about the divine revelations, she answered whether the revelations were correct can be understood by looking at the results of my actions, pointing to the victory at Orléans. When asked about loyalty to the church's authority, she answered she would follow only God, cleverly evading a direct denial of church authority. In May 1431, the trial became harsh for Joan. Amidst long interrogations and prison life, she was cornered both mentally and physically. On May 24th, Joan signed a document denying her faith and admitting to heresy. This was forced upon her and did not reflect her true feelings. However, with this the possibility of avoiding the death penalty temporarily emerged. It seems true that there were quite a few judges who wanted to save Joan from execution at least. However, since Joan wore men's clothes again after her abjuration, the judges deemed this a relapse into heresy, leading to the final death sentence. However, inside the prison, she was constantly watched by 2 or 3 soldiers, and even while sleeping or relieving herself, she had to expose herself before male soldiers. One day, Joan was raped or nearly raped by soldiers. To prevent the soldiers' assault, she apparently changed into the male clothing that was inexplicably always kept nearby. Her claims regarding this were ignored, and it seems there was a plot lurking to entrap Joan into heresy no matter what. Due to the relapse into heresy, the gravest sin, Joan was sentenced to death by fire. She regained her strong conviction and accepted the court's conclusion without fear of death. On May 30th, 1431, tied to a pillar set up in the Vieux-Marche Square in Rouen, Joan was executed. Until her final moment, she shouted the name Jesus, continuing to show her faith in God. The ashes of the legendary Virgin Joan were thrown into the Seine River to leave no trace. However, her martyrdom was deeply engraved in the hearts of many people, sparking patriotism among the French. Joan of Arc's image as a self-sacrificing hero raised the morale of France as a whole, leading to increased support for Charles VII. In subsequent battles, Rouen, where Joan was tried, was recaptured in 1449. The following year, the advance continued into Normandy and Gascony, with the defeat of the English army. At the Battle of Castellon in 1453, England withdrew from the continent. Effectively, the 100 Years' War came to an end here. Later, Charles VII, perhaps concerned that his crown was brought by Joan, who remained branded a heretic, affecting his authority as king. Or perhaps, helped by a desire to clear the thick fog before his eyes 25 years after Joan was executed. In 1456, requested a retrial to uncover the truth of the trial. The church retried Joan's case. It was revealed that the male clothing, which was the cause of her relapse, was to protect herself from soldiers' assaults. The legitimacy of the original trial was denied, and the church revoked the heresy verdict. Joan was declared innocent, and her honor was restored. Furthermore, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church. Joan of Arc's life and trial were tragic events, reflecting the political and religious dynamics of the time. But they proved that her belief and courage had a major impact on history.